This is William and Lonsdale, a podcast about the legal ecosystem in Victoria and the fascinating people and stories that make it tick. Today, your host Michael Green speaks with iconic Australian writer Helen Garner. Throughout her long and distinguished career, Helen has maintained a fascination with our justice system, often spending countless hours hanging around the courts, as she describes it. Her loitering has resulted in a Walkley Award winning piece for Time magazine, numerous stories for The Monthly, and the best-selling novels Joe Cinque's Consolation and This House of Grief. Helen has written about many facets of our justice system, from complex legal cases and exceptional practitioners to broken families and the selfless volunteers that support them. And among the many outcomes of her work, she loves when her writing brings people into the court, especially when it's one of her own.
I remember once when my granddaughter was her 16th birthday, and I was taking her downtown to buy her a pair of Doc Marten boots. And we walked past the Supreme Court and she said, "Is that the court where you go?" And I said, "Yeah, that's the one." She said, "Wow." I said, "Do you want to go in and have a look?" She said, "Oh, yeah." So we went in and we just walked in, sat down in a court. There was, and everything was already rolling, and some pathologist was on the stand giving these really quite gruesome details about an unfortunate man who'd been bashed outside a bar and died. And I thought, my first thought was, oh my God, I looked at the girl, my granddaughter, and then I looked at the judge, who was a woman who I vaguely knew, and I thought, that judge is going to think I'm really sick bringing this girl into this trial. And I sat there with my knees knocking and thinking, I can't get up now right in the middle of this and drag her out the door and disturb everyone. And there was a little pause, and I turned, I said to my granddaughter, "How are you okay with this?" And she said, "Yeah." She said, "It's really, really interesting and it's not emotional." And I thought, yeah, she's a natural.
Our guest this morning in Lives in the Law is Helen Garner, writer. Helen, our guests in Lives in the Law so far have mainly been lawyers, but you are a writer and your life in the law has been as an observer of the legal process, and among your many books, two of them have been best-selling books about the law, Joe Cinque's Consolation and This House of Grief. And you've also written many pieces of long-form journalism about the law. But you'd been exposed to the legal world before then, when you supported a friend whose stepdaughter had been randomly murdered. Can you remember the circumstance of the case and how it affected you?
Vividly. It was my first chance of going to a court. I like most people in the population, I didn't realise you could walk into a trial. And I thought if I went with somebody who had a right to be there, I could get in. So I saw it as a sort of an entree, as it were, into the... I mean, that makes it sound rather cynical. Really, I had two reasons for going. Firstly, was because he was so shattered by what had happened, and I thought I could... he might like someone to be with him. And secondly, was my curiosity. That's why I was there and how I got to be there. And it was a tremendous experience for me to go to that trial, because it was the first time I understood that they really do have to prove the charge. There were two people charged with the crime, with the murder of this young girl and her boyfriend. And of course, like everyone in the room listening to the evidence, I longed for these horrible people to be basically strung up. You know, you don't worry about morals when you're sitting there listening to such a terrible story. So I was thunderstruck to find that the judge's charge to the jury was that the woman, that the evidence against her was not sufficient to support the charge and that they were not to find her guilty. That was a moment, and this is very early in my experience of courts, where I actually sensed in the room what I thought of in retrospect as the spirit of the law. I thought they really do have to prove it. And I felt this force in the room, which was an almighty power, the mighty power of the state, but it was controlled by reason. And I really think that was one of the most awesome experiences of my life. And I didn't realise it fully, I think, until years had passed and I'd been to other trials and thought about it a lot more. But I left that court stunned, really.
And that force that you felt in the room, it was a force for good. It wasn't a force of vengeance or retribution. It was a force of good and fairness and justice.
I think it was a combination of a sense of the tremendous power of the state, and which in a sense is neither good nor bad, because in any regime it can be good or bad. But what impressed me was that it was being controlled by reason, and that seemed to me an enormous force of good.
That's, I mean, what an amazing thing to be exposed to and a revelation to have. But your experience of the law was far more prosaic, or your first experience of the law was far more prosaic than the Supreme Court and the force of the state. It was you witnessing a motor vehicle accident in the mid-80s, what in the trade is called a crash and bash, and you going to the magistrates' court as a witness. Can you remember what it was like to go into the witness box and to give evidence and to be cross-examined by an opposition barrister?
Yes, I remember that vividly as well. I think it was in Fitzroy Magistrates Court, and I had what I thought was a perfectly clear memory of what had happened, because I'd been standing on the balcony of my house just idly looking out, and the house was on a corner of an intersection up in North Carlton, and I saw exactly what happened. And because I was above it, I could have drawn a little diagram of the curve of the path of the cars. And so I thought, oh, this outrageous thing here, so I'm happy to give evidence. So I get up, and they asked me what I'd seen, and I said what I'd seen. And then what I thought of as this absolute twerp of a bloke began to hammer away at my simple tale. And he said, I remember one thing he said was, but all you've got really is a sense impression, isn't it? I thought this was the most outrageous thing anybody had ever said to me, and I was really hot under the collar. And I probably made a complete fool of myself. I thought, well, what else have I got to offer? In that sort of huffy tone. The guy went down. And,
so your evidence was accepted?
Well, apparently.
And you didn't enjoy the experience of being cross-examined?
No, I broke out in a sweat of rage.
The first time that I'm aware that you wrote about the legal system was the murder trial of Daniel Valerio in 1993. Daniel was a toddler who was murdered by his mother's boyfriend. You weren't sent there by a newspaper or a magazine to write about it. You happened to be in the court at the time. What were you doing in the court?
Well, I was just poking my nose into other people's business, really. I'd read in the paper that there was somebody up on this charge, and as I often do when I'm reading about crime in the paper, I thought, what sort of a bloke would do a thing like that? I'd really like to have a look at that person. I just wanted to clap eyes on him, and so I just hopped on my bike and went down to the court, and by this time I knew you were actually allowed to go in. And so I went in and meekly sat there, and I began to watch this appalling story play out. Also present in the court that day was the cartoonist from The Age, John Spooner, whom I vaguely knew, and he was just practising drawing, watching people, because there were a lot of people sitting very still. And he came up to me and said, he said hello, and we all went off for lunch. And after lunch he came back and said that he was working for Time magazine, and when he'd been there at lunchtime he told them that I was in the court, and the editor said to him, send a message to Helen, does she want to write about this for us? So that's when I got out my notebook, but up until then I'd just been an ordinary citizen having a look.
Who was interested in the legal process, and as you say, interested in the people in the process to see what they were like. And you won a Walkley Award for that piece of writing?
Yes, I did. Yeah, I didn't even know what a Walkley Award was. I mean, I'm not a journalist. I haven't never been in a newsroom in my life. I'm not a trained journalist. I've never been a cadet or anything. I was just this sort of blow-in. It's a terrific challenge to a writer to write about a case, a court case, and a trial. I mean, the material that's before you is so extraordinary and so rich and complicated and fascinating that you've got to take that into account, but also you're learning about the processes of a trial, which are often quite mysterious to a stranger, to a beginner. The rules of evidence are hard to grasp. Yes, it's an extraordinary experience.
You've said that Walkley Award is the award you are most proud of. Is that still the case?
Yeah, and I got another one some years later. Yeah, I was thrilled to bits with them, because when I wrote a book called The First Stone, which got me into a lot of trouble in the 90s, there was a lot of very bitchy attacks on me in various publications and, sort of literary magazines. And some of the outraged feminists who were attacking me were casting aspersions on my abilities as what they called a journalist. They said masquerading as a journalist, making a guest appearance as a journalist. They used expressions like that. And I thought, bugger you, I have won a Walkley, so shove that up your ass. That's what I wanted to say. I am a journalist, and I'm proud to be a journalist. I've got a lot of friends who are journalists, and a good journalist is a terrific person. A person of enormous curiosity and persistence and, actually a bit like a lawyer when you think about it.
Would you say fair-mindedness about good journalists? They are fair-minded?
Yes, a good journalist is someone who doesn't print scuttlebutt, who checks their sources and who has the persistence to follow a story against obstacles that are placed in their way. I'm proud to have called myself at least an amateur journalist.
We better get on to the books that you have written about the law and the legal process, which have been very highly regarded. The first one was Joe Cinque's Consolation, and the second one is House of Grief. Joe Cinque was killed by his girlfriend injecting heroin into him after she'd laced his coffee with rohypnol. She'd even told her friend she intended to do it. You at the time were living in Sydney. What made you go down to Canberra to decide to sit in on a trial?
I didn't even know the story. I had a phone call from Tim Bowden, who's a very eminent journalist, probably, half a generation senior to me. I mean, senior in life, not in profession. He just called me up. He said, I didn't know him, and just rang me up and said, listen, I've heard there's this murder trial down in Canberra that sounds like your kind of thing. It's something you might be interested in. And he outlined it to me, and I thought, I was very down in the dumps because my second marriage had just broken up, and I was kind of licking my wounds in a flat all by myself and feeling very sorry for myself and not knowing what to do next. And anyway, he just kind of threw this into my lap, and I thought, well, I'll just go down to Canberra and have a look. So I did, and took me a while to get hooked on that one. It didn't immediately sort of grab me by the throat like the other one did. I spent a lot of time that year just going back and forth between Canberra and Sydney, exposing myself to the story, and it was a terrible story, and there was a great amount of anguish in it. I learnt an enormous amount about how trials are conducted and what the law is, and how somebody can construct an argument which to an outsider looks incredibly cold-blooded.
And this was the argument constructed by Lex Lasry on behalf of Anu Singh,
yes,
the woman accused of killing Joseph Cinque.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So do you remember what the basis of his argument was?
Yes, it's a very complicated thing. I wouldn't be able to sort of lay it out now briefly. Some of it had to do with duty of care, which was something I'd never given any thought to ever in my life, really. The phrase was sort of new to me.
And the duty that she owed to Joe Cinque.
Yes.
I guess it's her duty of care to him.
Well, apparently not. And no, actually the duty of care part came up with the second girl, who was Anu Singh's best friend. And she, one of the famous points of this trial is that after Joe Cinque had been given what one assumes, but it could not be proved, was the fatal injection, the killer's best friend came into the room and saw him lying on the bed, blue and taking a breath every few seconds, and she just turned around and went away. And to your ordinary person in the street, that seems so outrageous you can hardly contemplate it. I mean, these people weren't junkies. They were just ordinary students. They tried a bit of drugs here and there, but they weren't sort of debased creatures who would just turn and run from the imminent death of someone they knew and liked. It was very shocking. And so I thought, oh, well, she'll go down for sure, because that's obviously such an appalling thing. But her defence counsel produced this argument about duty of care that just made my blood run cold. And she was found to have no case to answer. And so sometime after this, when I was trying to write the book, I thought, I'm going to take a punt and I'll just contact the judge. And so I wrote him a letter and asked if he'd talk to me. And I thought he'd just brush it aside. But he was very friendly and said, please, come up and come to Chambers and I'll see you. So we had a very, very interesting conversation. I've been always grateful to him for that generosity. I think it was partly because he must have felt pretty bad about the whole story himself. But that business of duty of care is so shocking to an ordinary person that I still can't get over it. And to see that argument coolly presented by a brilliant counsel, which was Lex Lasry, first time I'd ever seen him, I was speechless, really.
So did you come away with a negative view of the system because of that?
Yeah, I was horrified. I thought because the other thing that had happened, of course, was, I was not a disinterested observer in this, but this time I'd got to know Joe Cinque's parents. And how I got to know them was at a break in the trial in the women's toilets. I was standing there putting on some lipstick at the mirror, and Mrs. Cinque came out of a toilet and started to put lipstick on, and we looked at each other in the mirror. And she said, "Hello, I see you. What are you doing here? You journalist?" I go, "Oh, sort of." And I said, "If I write something about this, would you speak to me?" It was a strange moment. And it also seems very sort of significant to me that we weren't looking at each other right in the eye. We were looking at each other's faces in the mirror. And she examined me very carefully. She looked me up and down. And she said, "Yes, I will." So that was a very important moment. But it also was a kind of disastrous moment because it meant that I was no longer capable of a detachment in the story. I was, as it were, infected by the anguish and grief of the dead man's parents. And so that's why that book has, it's not a detached account. And I had to build myself into that book so that I could show my changes, the changes that I went through while I was watching the trial. And in a sense, that's one of the things that greatly interests me about watching a trial, is how listening to the evidence, your feeling about it swings. It swings from, some days you think, "Oh, but of course he should immediately go to jail. He should get a life sentence for this." And then the next day, the other counsel swings the whole thing around and you go, "Oh, but wait a minute, maybe is there something I missed here?" And so in a sense, what you're doing as an observer in a trial is you're thinking like a juror. You're allowing the arguments to affect you and to persuade you one way or another. I've never been on a jury. I've never even been called for some reason, much to my disappointment. But I found that very interesting, how courts are supposed to be places of reason, and to a large extent they are, but the place is a great cataract of emotion. The room is full of emotion, and it's a matter of being able to sort of navigate that flood in order to write about it.
In observing these things and observing juries and taking into account what you've just said about the flood of emotions that's going on, are you impressed with juries, the decisions they reach?
I'm astonished by them. I have a great feeling for them. I can see how they sort of suffer, the pain that they go through. I remember in that Valerio trial how there were two trials actually in Valerio. The first one, the jury couldn't reach a verdict, and so they had to dismiss them and start again. But both times this weeping broke out in the jury box. Just one person would start to cry, and then all of them, the men, the women, they would just be sobbing loudly. And I thought, gosh, what a process it is to try to absorb and understand the evidence that's been presented and actually make a decision. It's a colossal task and awesome. And I think people I know who've been on juries and have spoken to me, like very honourably, they wouldn't give me all the details that I wanted. Just that sense of a bunch of disparate people who come in off the street. They don't know each other. They belong to different classes. They're different colours. They've got different native languages. And suddenly they find themselves in this box and they have to listen and work together. What I find wonderful and thrilling and sort of gives me hope for the human race is that bunch of people can mould themselves into a functioning unit and arrive at a decision. One of my sisters was on a jury once, and she, because my house is on a direct line to the courts, to Flagstaff Station, she came and stayed at my place for the week she was on this jury. And she was super honourable, wouldn't tell me anything, but I could see she was in a
What sort of a sister is that?
She's very honourable and stern. But the interesting thing was that the first day she came home, I said, "How'd you go?" And she said, "They made me the foreperson." I said, "What did they say?" She said, "Well, a lot of them were like tradies, and then there were a couple of posh ladies from the other side of the river." And she said, they said to me, "You should be this foreperson." And she said, and I go, "Why?" And they said, "Because you're a singer in a band and you're used to standing up and talking in front of strangers." So anyway, she was very upset. She'd come home every night and I'd say, "How'd you go?" And she'd cry and she'd say, it wasn't a murder, it was just some sort of money case. I can't remember what it was, but blackmail. It was a blackmail case. Anyway, she said, the awful thing is we know they're not telling us something. We know there's stuff here going on and they're not telling us and we don't know what it is and it's terribly frustrating and we don't know how to handle it. And I realised then that once again, as an observer sitting there in the court, you actually know more than the jury knows. This shocked me when I grasped it. You see, all these things fell very slowly. These pennies dropped in me very slowly because I've never had any of this explained to me. I've never done a law course or sat down and tried to read a book explaining it all. I just sort of throw myself in there and I've learnt very slowly in rather stupid, a lot of the time I feel quite stupid in a court. I think, why the hell? Why wouldn't he let him say that? And I couldn't grasp it. And then afterwards I'd go and get somebody to explain it to me. But in a sense, I think that's why people like those two books of mine about trials, because I built that into the story, that sort of stupidity that you feel. We go, what the hell? Hang on, I thought this was so, but now I see that it's that, and he's pulled the rug out. And so I put in all those changes. And so I think they give people a sense of what it's like to be actually in the room. Whereas, you could write a book if you had the talent, like Evil Angels, like John Bryson's book about the Chamberlain case, which is much more detached and he's, because he's a barrister himself, he can kind of hover over the story. But I very rarely feel in court that I'm hovering over the story. I feel like I'm right there in the guts of it and I have to kind of stagger home at the end of the day and get over what I've seen and felt and try to sort of find myself a little island in that mighty river of stuff that's rolling past.
Helen, is that why you say it is important to stay as close as you can to the dumb cluck in the street?
Yeah, because I think I never set out to do this. You see, what happens is, as a dumb cluck in the street, I go into the court, I go into the trial and I sit there for 6 weeks or however long it goes on. And I'm sort of like someone trying to keep swimming. Then I have to sit down and write the book, and that's the terrifying moment, is when I've got all the stuff there, I've got the transcripts, I've got all the notes I kept, I've got the sort of journals I kept every day and every night, and when I was actually at the trial. And I think, what the hell am I going to do with this massive material? And the only way that I am able to do it is to follow my own path through it. On day one of a trial, the first day that I go down to Office Works and I buy myself a big exercise book. And that is going to be the journal that I keep right through the trial. It's separate from my personal diaries, that's another thing. But this is it's a daily account of my engagement with the material. When I first did this, which was with the Joe Cinque case, I had no idea what I was doing. I just knew that I was filled with thoughts and feelings and I needed to write them down to sort of relieve my nerves, as it were. But I found as I went along, and by the time I got to the end of that trial, I was lost. I didn't know how to write the book. I looked again at those journals and I saw that there was a kind of spine running through them, which was a narrative, and that if I followed that thread, I didn't drown. And so that's one of the reasons why there's an I narrator in those books, because that's the only way I can think of to do it. It's not because I thought it was that my opinions were more interesting than anything else. It was just that my experience of being there is the most interesting part of the thing for me when it comes to writing it, and it's the most vivid because it's about what I'm looking at and what I'm hearing and the mood in the room and the change of mood in the room and the distress of people in the room, strange bursts of laughter that suddenly come out, and even the accused person sometimes will laugh. Those are the things that, if I follow that thread, that's how I find my way through the material.
Well, now let's get back to your second book about the legal process, or specifically on the legal process, This House of Grief. This is a case where a man named Robert Farquharson drove his car into a dam, killing 3 sons. And I think you followed it from the committal in Geelong Magistrates Court, the first trial in the Supreme Court, then a successful appeal to the Court of Appeal by the accused, Robert Farquharson, and then the second trial where Robert Farquharson was found guilty and sentenced to life with a 33-year minimum. I think by coincidence, the judge in that second trial was Lex Lasry, who had been defence counsel in the Joe Cinque trial.
Yes.
One of those little twists and turns that come quite often in our lives. This was a 7-year process. You followed the whole thing through. How did it affect you, working on this for 7 years? Did it consume you? Did it take a real toll of you?
Yes, it did. It broke my heart, really. It's a sort of experience that it's taken me years to get over it. And you see, I've always had this fantasy that I could recover from things quickly. I mean, work things. I'd look at the real journalists who are in the court and I'd see how they seem to have a kind of carapace on them that protected them from the distress of these stories. See, I suppose in my heart I wished always that he hadn't done it, because it was just so terrible to me to think that a man would kill his children. I mean, it's in the paper every day. It's not as if it's a new thing. But I don't know, somehow the committal hearing was held in Geelong, and that's my hometown. And for some reason I had a feeling of sort of intimacy with the case. I don't know why. I felt...
Where he drove into the dam was Winchelsea, which is
well, I know that road. And, and also the fact that he had two older sisters, and I could see how they loved him and cared for him and worried about him. And I come from a family, there's 5 girls and 1 boy, and I just, I know what it is to be a big sister. I'm usually quite helpless before this emotional part of the matter. And the thing with Maria Cinque, Maria Cinque and I are still friends. Her husband died. He died a couple of years ago, and I loved them and became very close to them. And so I'm not suggesting I'm stating baldly that I'm not good at maintaining detachment in these stories. And so for that reason, perhaps, I was sort of devastated by it. And because also I had grandchildren, little grandsons at the time who were the same age as the Farquharson boys, and there were some parts of that trial that were so frightful that I know Lex Lasry told me that he just couldn't read the book. He said, I can't read it, I can't go there again. And he said that they used these things called submergence videos. So they got a car and lowered it with cameras inside, and they lowered it into a dam to see what happened to the doors and when you could open the doors and when the water pressure stopped you from opening the doors. And that was nightmarish evidence, and people wept in the court at that. It was unbearable. But I thought, well, I should toughen up. Look at these journalists. They don't go stagger out weeping at the end of every day. But maybe they did, or maybe they waited till they got home. But so I finally wrote the book, and out it came. And then about a year later, I was sitting in the lobby of the ABC waiting to be interviewed about something. And the door from the street opened, and in walked this bloke who I recognised as one of the journalists who'd been at the Farquharson trial, and I'd just been on nodding terms with him there. But I thought, he probably won't remember me, but so I waved to him, and he was on the other side of that big lobby, and he recognised me. He rushed across the lobby, and he said, Helen, how'd you pull up after the Farquharson trial? And I said, terrible. I thought I was going to have a nervous breakdown. And he said, thank God you said that. He said, so did I. He said, I just feel like I actually did crack up. I had to leave my job. And God, I was so relieved to hear. I had a feeling of comradeliness at that moment that I hadn't felt before. I thought, I'm not the only one who can hardly bear this stuff. And I wonder too, if I'd been younger when I followed that trial, it might have been less devastating to me. I think as I've got older, I've found that I can hardly stand the amount of pain that's in a courtroom. Even in the magistrate's court, there are people there who are in such trouble, and you see they're never going to get their lives together. You sit there, comfortably watching, and it's just too painful.
I just don't want to exacerbate your pain, but I understand what you're saying. It makes me wonder about the judges and the barristers who are observing these situations and running these trials daily.
Yeah, I've wondered that often, and I remember during the Farquharson trial, when it was lunchtime, I used to go into the Supreme Court Library, which is a place I love, and I just used to go at random along the shelves and of the, I don't know what you call them, where there's decisions, judgments of various cases, and I'd just pull them down at random and open them at random. And I felt I'd see in some of the judgments there a great modesty and sorrow in the judges' voices, not always, clearly. In fact, quite rarely, I suspect, because people don't want to expose those emotions and they're presumably not relevant, or they're thought to be not relevant. But I'd occasionally come upon a judge basically saying, I don't understand. The subtext of what he was writing was, I don't understand this. I don't understand, what does it mean that this man could have killed this little girl and shoved her body into a drain? I don't know what to say or what to do. And I don't know how people stand it. I think there's got to be, maybe that takes us back to what I was saying at the beginning about the role of reason. Maybe reason, if you're trained as a lawyer, you're highly trained in how to reason and how to, as it were, step onto the bank. I've got this vision of a river rushing, and I'm always looking for a little island or a rock or a log that I can hang onto. But maybe judges don't get their feet wet. Maybe they can stand on the bank and watch it go by and use all their sharpness of intellect to deal with it. So that's not my job.
William and Lonsdale is brought to you by Green's List, one of the leading multidisciplinary barristers lists in Australia. Green's List believe in promoting conversation around the ideas and issues that shape not only our legal system, but our wider community.
In reviewing this House of Grief, David Marr called it a love song to the law. Was it? And if so, why?
Well, I was actually really thrilled that he said that. It's definitely a love song to the court. I dedicated it to the court, and that's to the Supreme Court. The title, This House of Grief, it's from a Hungarian novel that I read where a person talked to, I think he was even perhaps talking about a police station, but just talking about a building in which human agony is dealt with. And I guess in that regard, that's what I find awesome about the law, is that it's this enormous construction which has been invented and devised over centuries to try to deal with the wildness of human beings and how mad we are and how cruel and how weak some of us are and how some of us suffer at the hands of others. And we've had to, the human race has had to devise a series of structures which we hope will enable us to deal with these terrible things. It's as big and as complex as a religion or as poetry and literature. It's got that degree of complexity. And I think in that sense, my book is a love song to it, yeah.
Has it won your respect as a system which has to deal with our wildness as human beings, our cruelty to each other? Has it won your respect that it does in some way contain these things and help us function better?
Yes, I hate to generalise. Actually, I feel very uncomfortable generalising in huge terms, although I just have for the last 5 minutes. But you see, the other thing about it is it's not superhuman. It's made by humans to deal with humans. And so all human faults are present in the law, as well as in the matter that the law is devised to deal with. So there's nothing perfect about it. And I know there's terrible mad things happen, like, the whole Nicola Gobbo business and all that crazy stuff and injustice. And I don't want to sort of whitewash it, but it seems to me that it's a tremendous effort. And in that way, sometimes I've sat in court, especially during a plea hearing. I find a plea hearing very moving somehow because it's small and intimate and it's people talking and reasoning with each other and explaining things. And I find that, I think I've said somewhere in the book or somewhere in something else I wrote, that it's like a string quartet, whereas a full-on jury trial is a symphony and a plea hearing is a string quartet. It's quiet and it's still full of feeling and an attempt of reason, but it's quiet and it's polite and people aren't sort of grandstanding. And I greatly value those moments that I've seen.
Are there enough of those moments? Is it a system which can be almost inhuman in grinding exceedingly finely, or is it sufficiently informed by the human qualities that we all love and admire, the qualities of empathy and compassion and understanding? And have we got enough of that in the system? Or is it balanced?
I would think probably not. It's, as I was saying, it's a human system. It's made by humans, so we're going to stuff up. It's going to be a stuff up, and it's an endless struggle. Like everything human, it's an endless struggle. There's never, every now and then there's a little moment of peace where, okay, Donald Trump loses the election. We get 4 seconds of relief, and then all the chaos crashes in again. And I think it's the same with the law. There's just no end to human craziness and sinfulness. And so I think there are times when a law is changed, and that relieves a certain degree of awfulness in the way that certain cases have been dealt with, but it's an endless battle. So I don't know the answer to your question.
If all the world is a stage, then it seems to me that a courtroom is a stage par excellence.
Yes.
It has players with roles, judges, barristers, solicitors, jury, witness, accused, etc. But I'm particularly interested in the professional players, but the judges and the barristers. They wear costumes,
Yes.
wigs and gowns, and they play a role. As someone who's observed them now for decades, what do you make of them? Do you see them as important players? Do you see them playing a significant role in our community?
Judges and lawyers.
Judges and barristers particularly, who stand up and play.
Yes, very much so. And I actually, I know this is a very old-fashioned view, but I think wigs are fantastic. I think wigs and gowns are really important. I mean, I reckon if I was up on a charge, a serious charge, and I walked into a court and just saw people in ordinary clothes there, I don't think I'd be very happy, because I would want to feel what I think those costumes do is make things less personal. They make a gesture of respect towards the history and the creation of the laws by which we try to govern ourselves and rule ourselves. Well, put it this way, I know quite a few judges and barristers now, and some of them I like and respect enormously. Others I find completely insufferable. You know, or there's plenty of insufferable people in any profession. I suppose in a way, as I was saying earlier in this interview, I was talking about journalists and how I like them and how I respect them. And I guess I respect people who work face-to-face each day with the mess of human life. I love and respect those people. And, I mean, same goes for the police. I mean, the police is full of good people, but there's some really rotten ones in there as well. And when I once was writing an article about the morgue, I spent 3 or 4 days in the morgue, and the people that I met there, I was once again awestruck by them, the extremity of their experience and their decency and dignity and their professionalism and their humour. And I remember asking them, the technicians, I mean, I stood there while people, watching autopsies and bodies being, cut up basically. And I was, the way that they dealt with their work was awesome to me. And in their company, I felt that I could bear what they were doing. There was something about their attitude towards their work that I keep going for words like to ennoble something. But you would think that to go to a morgue would be a squalid and hideous experience. But I actually found that it was. I learnt something that I can hardly put into words. And I guess I feel the same about people in the law, that they have a lot of more experience than the average person of the awfulness of human beings and of its need to be controlled and regulated or reasoned about, examined carefully. And I find that quite moving and terribly impressive.
Lives in the Law is proudly sponsored by City Maps Illustrated. Their recent publication, The Melbourne Map, is a celebration of our wonderful city. This stunning hand-drawn illustration, which took more than 3 years to create, is available as an art print, jigsaw puzzle and calendar. The perfect acquisition for your home, office or corporate gifting. More information can be found on their website, themelbournemap.com.au.
Let's move away from the nitty-gritty of the law and back to one of your other brushes with the law in your field of professional expertise, writing. You have worked or assisted through the Judicial College judges in their writing of judgments. What was that about?
Well, I was asked if I wanted to take part in these little workshops that this would be a good 10 years ago. They were running, I think it was Linda Desso who invited me to take part. It was, I think, a 3-day gig, and people came from all over Australia to do this, and they were judicial officers, there were magistrates and people from VCAT, and then people from high courts, and I didn't quite know why I'd been asked to do this, but so I thought, I'll just dive in. So we were sent in advance of the date. Each judicial officer had to send in 2 judgments, decisions that had already been delivered, and we were going to work on those in a kind of workshop situation. So I'm reading these pieces of writing, and I thought, I don't understand these at all. I have no idea what these are about. And I'm on the tram going down to where this thing was on. And my knees were knocking. I thought, I'm about to make the most colossal fool of myself. So the first thing that happened was there's this guy, this American professor of law and literature called Jim Raymond, who was running this course. And he got up and gave the opening address of this gig. And it was called, I think, The Architecture of the Judgment. And listening to him, I thought, I know why I don't understand these. It's because they're really badly written. It's not because I'm stupid. I am not stupid. Hooray. So I sit down and we had face-to-face, you had to work with one of the judicial officers, and I had this guy who was a magistrate from Kalgoorlie, and he had sent in this judgment that was, to me, completely incomprehensible. I had absolutely no idea what it was about. And I thought, when I looked at him, he seemed like a nice guy. So I said, look, thought I might as well cut to the chase. I said, listen, I've got a problem with this. I just don't understand what this is about. I have no idea what it's about. And he looked at me and he said, he was completely amazed. And I said, well, can you just run it, just talk it through to me? And he said, sure, I can do that. He said, well, there's this bit of land, right? And it's got some gold in it. And I said, but you haven't mentioned that anywhere in the judgment. He said, why would I do that? And so, I batted away at him, and finally I got him to right up the front of the judgment, I got him to see what Jim Raymond had said was the very first bit of one of these judgments should say who did what to whom. That was his very blunt approach. So I got him to explain that, and so then we could clear up all the rest. So, we halved the length of it. But it was a moment of great enlightenment to me that the law is so full of jargon, and often people just don't care if people outside the law can't understand it. And so often in these little courses that we gave, which I loved, I came to really enjoy them, we'd ask the people who'd come along, the judicial officers, we'd say, who is your reader? And so in other words, who are you addressing in this piece of writing? And they'd always say the court above and the parties, in that order often. And it dawned on me after a while that they were scared, that there was a hell of a lot of fear in the writing, and that was what was making the writing bad, because they were writing defensively.
They feared the court above them.
They feared that they would be overturned. And because this was all new to me, because I was just looking at it as a piece of writing, and I just simply couldn't understand why they couldn't say, okay, this bloke had a licence to mine the gold out of this, he wasn't using it, and so this other company over here wants to get rid of him and get a licence to... Why couldn't they just say that? And this was a mystery to them, that I expected that. They didn't ever think that people who weren't concerned with the matter would want to read it. So that in itself was pretty interesting to me.
You talk about great clonking subordinate clauses back to back. Now, as someone who has done his own fair share of legal reading, I can understand exactly what you're saying there. Bolted together by verbs in the passive voice.
Yeah, that's exactly what they were. They were it was barbaric writing. But see, when you think of being bolted together, that's the exact quality of it was like somebody bolting together a kind of a defensive wall. And see, after a while we realised, the people running this course realised that they needed to get some guys in there, some guys and women in there from the higher courts, so they could say, listen, we don't want this shit. We don't want to have to plough our way through 25 pages of shit. Can't you just boil it down? We haven't got time to read this stuff. Why is that there? Why is that there? And the person in the lower court would say, but I put that in because I thought that if I didn't put it in, I'd be criticised. And it was as if what they didn't have the nerve to do was digest the thing and then write the judgment. They sort of worked through it point by point by point instead of striding through it and taking, I need this, I need this, I need this, which of course is how you write a book. You can't put everything in because no one will read it and they'll just chuck it at the wall. You've got to take command of the material and then go striding through it. And this was fantastically fun to help people to do.
Are you aware of it having made any ongoing changes to legal writing?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that because I don't see the legal writing, but I know I made a couple of friendships through the course, and I know that one person at least has written to me gratefully and said I'd saved them a lot of time. It's quite time-saving, not to sort of commando crawl your way through the material, but to stride, stand above it and grab the bits that you need.
To me, in some books, not all books, it becomes a conversation with the author. I certainly felt that with Joe Cinque's Consolation and This House of Grief that I was talking to you, Helen. What are you saying to me, the reader? What are you expecting of me by taking me into a courtroom and having me witness the drama and often the pain of a trial?
Well, my first expectation or my first hope is that you will keep reading, that you won't get bored. I'm hoping that the way I write will hold your attention. I think that it's a very complicated question. I mean, it's psychologically quite complicated. My aim in writing is to keep the work as close to speech as I can. I think that doesn't preclude using long sentences. The sort of writing that I enjoy reading is, that I most enjoy reading, is where the narrating voice is close to speech. I love it. And it makes me feel a kind of companionship with the writer and a shared curiosity. And I guess that's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that that I can persuade a reader to see what's important about what I'm talking about. See, when I first started out as a writer, women weren't, in Australia anyway, women weren't sort of well thought of as writers. You know, we were always told that our concerns were secondary and minor, and that things that happened in houses and bedrooms and kitchens were less worthy of attention than ones that were about wars or politics or mighty journeys. So I've always felt that I wanted to sort of break through that feeling. I want to be able to share with the reader my fascination with what's going on right in front of me, and that's my. It's a kind of companionable feeling that I'm trying to create, and so I'm really happy that you said that, because maybe it's working.
So you want to take me into the courtroom like the 16-year-old girl who went with you to This House of Grief,
yeah,
and to sit next to you,
yeah,
and to jointly experience what is occurring.
Yeah, and I suppose that goes back to, I was very surprised when I published the Joe Cinque book, that was the first one, when people, like highly educated people, would say to me, how did you get permission to go to that trial? Who let you in? And I was rocked to find that people don't know that you can just walk in, and that it's your right as a citizen to see what's being done in your name, basically. So that's one thing I wanted, was to say, look, this goes on every day. These stories are happening. Let's go in here and have a look. I remember once when my granddaughter was her 16th birthday, and I was taking her downtown to buy her a pair of Doc Marten boots. And we walked past the Supreme Court, and she said, is that the court where you go? And I said, yeah, that's the one. She said, wow. I said, do you want to go in and have a look? She said, oh, yeah. So we went in and we just walked in, sat down in a court. There was, and everything was already rolling, and some pathologist was on a stand giving these really quite gruesome details about an unfortunate man who'd been bashed outside a bar and died. And I thought, my first thought was, oh my God, I looked at the girl, my granddaughter, and then I looked at the judge, who was a woman who I vaguely knew, and I thought, that judge is going to think I'm really sick bringing this girl into this trial. And I sat there with my knees knocking and thinking, I can't get up now right in the middle of this and drag her out the door and disturb everyone. And there was a little pause, and I turned, I said to my granddaughter, are you okay with this? And she said, yeah. She said, it's really, really interesting, and it's not emotional. And I thought, yeah, she's a natural. I was so happy about that's what I want. I want people to see how kind of thrilling it is, this process, and how wonderfully structured it is. The sense of structure that you feel when you walk into a court. There's a special place where everyone sits, and I think that's one of the things that excite and move me about a court, is how, although what it's dealing with is that human wildness, it's devised a way of saying, all right, now let's come into this room. We'll all come into this room, and there's a special way that you behave in here. You don't yell and scream. Okay, you can cry. We try to be rational, and everyone takes it in turns, and those people sit over there and those people sit over there, and you can sit just there and you can listen. And if you can't stand it, you can get up very quietly and walk out. You know, this seems to me to be a hugely civilised phenomenon and process. And I guess that's, in those books, that's one of the things I want the reader to appreciate. And I want to be able to write in such a way that they can bear what I want to tell them, like the stuff about the submergence videos of those poor little Farquharson boys. And that links up with something else I was saying about how when I went to the morgue, what made that experience bearable, not only bearable to me, but intensely meaningful and awe-inspiring, was the behaviour, the formal behaviour of the people who were working in there. Their attitude towards their work made it possible for me to bear it. And I think that's what I want from the reader. I want them to, it's like I'm taking them by the hand. I'm saying, listen, come in here and I'll explain to you what's going on and we'll look at this together.
As well as that, it also gives you a shot of adrenaline to walk into a court building. That sounds like a junkie, of course, and you are a court junkie, Helen. What is the shot of adrenaline?
Well, I can answer that. I wouldn't have once been able to, but I do still feel it. I haven't been in courts much over the last years or so, but I didn't really understand it until I identified it with another situation in which I feel a shot of adrenaline. My office, where I work every day, is not far from the Royal Melbourne Hospital. And in the basement of the Royal Melbourne Hospital, they've got this fantastic cafeteria. And everybody goes there, the doctors and nurses and patients and blow-ins and people, everybody. And they make the most fantastic salad sandwiches in there. So I often go there for lunch. I just walk across the road and I go to the thing and I order a sandwich and I sit down at a table with a total stranger and often get into conversation with them. And after a while I realised that walking into that cafeteria gave me the same shot of just, all my nerves started to fizz a bit. And I thought, this is the same feeling I get when I walk into a court. How come? I thought, I know what it is. It's because everybody here is in extremis. Everyone here, this is an important moment in people's lives to be in this place. And you walk in the door and you can feel it. It's like a kind of an electric shock in the air that goes through you. And I connect it with people in the hospital who have just had a baby and they've just staggered down to have their first coffee, or somebody's got someone they've to take a break from watching somebody die, or someone's got a horrible injury. But they sit at the table and you say, geez, mate, what happened to your arm? And they tell you the answer and they're ready to talk. Everybody's got a story. That's what it is. They're all places that are full of stories.
Helen, thank you very much for giving us of your time today. Thank you very much for your decades of writing that we have all read and loved and continue to love, so please keep publishing. But to listen to your take on the law and the legal system, I think is really important to us as a community to get an insight into this system by an outsider who has something to tell us about the system and about ourselves. Really grateful. Thanks for coming.
Thanks. And I've got to say, I really enjoyed your questions. They were very provocative and they all seem to link up with each other in a subtle way, so I appreciate that. Thanks so much, Michael.
Show notes from today's episode can be found at greenslist.com.au/podcast. There you'll find links to things talked about in this episode, a transcript of the show, and some wonderful photos of our guests. If you're enjoying Lives in the Law, please tell your networks and subscribe, rate and review the show. It really helps others find out about us. Your host is former lawyer and Greenslist clerk Michael Green. Our show is produced by me, Catherine Green, mixed and mastered by Windmill Audio, and recorded by Alex McFarlane, who also wrote and performed all the music for the series. With COVID restrictions limiting numbers inside the County Court of Victoria, we are currently recording our shows at Owen Dixon Chambers, on the corner of William and Lonsdale Streets in our beautiful city of Melbourne. We acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of this land, and pay our respect to their elders past and present. There is no doubt that conversations about justice have been taking place on this land for thousands of years, and we are privileged to continue the discussion here today.